All right, so hi everyone. I'm Margot Conahan, ACRL's Manager of Professional Development. Thank you for joining us today for this ACRL Presents webinar. Our goal for these webinars is to bring our colleagues together to discuss issues of broad importance to the academic and research library community. Thanks for being here today. As I just mentioned, today's session is being recorded and we will email out the link to the recording shortly after the webinar, and it will also be available online. Today's webinar is using the new ACRL framework for impactful scholarship and metrics. The framework is designed to facilitate the work of academic institutions as they establish, evaluate, or update their guidelines for measuring the impact of academic librarian scholarship. I'd like to thank our presenters for being here with us today as they discuss their background research, introduce the framework, and discuss it in context of ACRL's open access and equity issues. Rachel Borchardt is the Associate Director of Research and Instructional Services and Science Librarian at American University. Alex Hodges is the Director of Gutman Library at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Jennifer Matthews is the Collection Strategy Librarian at Rowan University. Rachel, Alex, and Jennifer, thanks again for being with us today, and feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Margot, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I am one of the least important members of the committee, but I'm going to be starting out for us and just want to give a huge shout out to Rachel Borchardt, who was our committee chair and led us through the years to create this framework, and also helped us to get it published and out and accepted by the ACRL Board of Directors. So to begin with, the three of us, we are all three members of the committee, but we just want to start out by saying what our agenda is for today. We definitely would like to engage in questions with you all toward the end of the presentation. And probably the sooner the better. We will do our best to keep track of any questions that come in through the chat. So do know that we are paying attention, but if we miss something, just hold on and we'll make sure we'll get to it at the end. These are the main points that we're going to cover today, and we're going to divvy discussion of these points among the three panelists. So for just a little bit of information about the task force, as I was mentioning, we were given a charge, and Rachel was really the genesis of getting this work to ACRL. This is how our charge was created in 2017 after a call for participation was put out, and Rachel was able to settle committee membership. It's dwindled a little bit since we first started out, but each and every member of the committee has contributed to our final product and to get us to where we are today. So why? So I hope you all don't think I'm just completely sweet on Rachel. I am, but I wanted to also just kind of state that a lot of this work came out of her scholarship on altmetrics, along with University of Washington's Robin Shin-Romer, who was a member of our committee as well. And Rachel and I served together at American University as library faculty. And one of the challenges that we had in our positions was constantly updating our guidelines for the review of how our tenure, rank, and promotion guidelines would be revised and discussed amongst the library faculty, and also approved by administration and also the university-wide rank and tenure body. In that body, I served on the body for 3 years, and Rachel was also the chair of our library faculty council. And I think getting back to that word genesis, we were often asked to explain how we were evaluating our quality or impact. And looking around, we saw a number of different institutions having their own guidelines. And then we also have relied on ACRL so much for helping us to sort of streamline our thinking about so many things in our profession, but we lacked in the membership of ACRL, we lacked a document like this that's been created so that others can generate their own ideas about how to explain impact in their contexts, whether they are faculty librarians or staff librarians who are up for promotions or performance evaluations, and faculty librarians who might not have tenure but are still grappling with how to explain their promotion process. So altogether, we hope that this framework will open up discussions that can be had again in those local contexts at institutions. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's meant for sort of a generation of ideas, maybe gathering ideas from other institutions, which we have collaborated on to bring together into this document. Next slide. As with anything, we had to sort of focus, and we had to decide what would be included and what wouldn't be included in this final framework. So when we started out, we didn't set out to include these specific items. And you might question why. Well, again, there's such variability across our profession in how librarians are evaluated. And there are institutions that have a very traditional approach and conservative approach to not including, say, open access. We also, again, wanted to make sure that we were, again, focused on an end goal that everyone could use, but some of these items are also evolving in our profession right now, and future iterations of this framework can include this work. If you're interested in what values-based impact measurements looks like, I'm gonna put the link to this in the chat so you can see specifically what that means. So feel free to take a look. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that we had a very specific process in how we wanted to do our work from the beginning in 2017. And we divided the committee into three main areas. One subgroup was looking at other disciplines and associations and societies to see how impact had been defined outside of librarianship or information science. We also had another subgroup that looked at institutional documentation. So those are guidelines for rank or promotion or performance evaluation. And then we also had a third group that did do a survey of the ACRL membership, and response rate was okay. We had something like almost 500, 480 something folks participate, and that also informed the committee on how we should create and draft our framework. So I was part of the first group that was looking at the disciplinary examples. And in our review, for my work, I was specifically assigned social sciences. And I think as each person was looking at different areas of different disciplines, we went to associations for different disciplines. We looked to see what attributes were common across some of the guidelines or discussion of impact within the scholarly literature of the disciplines. So these are the specific attributes that we were finding fairly common across whatever documentation we could access. But I think it should be very, I think I should state very upfront that it's not consistent across the disciplines, and that shouldn't come as any surprise. Sometimes we were hunting and pecking across associations and actually coming out to be pretty surprised that other disciplines didn't have the kind of document that we were aiming to create. So our overall takeaways for those who were doing the disciplinary reviews, we pretty much came to see that those commonalities exist in those attributes that we were talking about, but also that there were other forms of scholarship that we might not have been considering within our profession of practitioner, academic librarians. So things like community service, digital scholarship, and then other areas, thinking about Boyer's model and looking specifically to documentation that was a bit more solid than other disciplines, and that was true of the AAA, the American Anthropological Association. And so we were able to use some of their results to help us move our thinking forward. So at this juncture, I'm going to toss the baton over to Jennifer, and Jennifer is going to talk about our work on institutional documentation.
Thanks, Alex. Another subgroup on the out of the task force did was go and survey many different institutions, both doctoral level and master's level, to see if we could find any documentation on their websites about how they looked at scholarship. And that's what this table indicates. And it's just, were we able to find anything? And for the most part, the R1 institutions were more prevalent with that information. And out of those, 40% of those ranked their research outputs in some ways. And generally that was peer-reviewed journal articles that were mentioned. Very few of any of those documents, only 17% mentioned some sort of journal preference. For the most part, there was no journal preference at all. And when it did mention it, it was a peer-reviewed a journal. So I'm sure that's not surprising to anyone. And there was very little specifics about how impact should be demonstrated within the documents themselves. A very small percentage, 10%, mentions that external evaluation should be a main factor for the impact determination. But generally it was left very vague and not documented out in what we found. And the overall focus for all of the institutions seemed to be on what the accepted or preferred outputs were, as opposed to how they were being evaluated and how they were being measured. So one of the things that we determined in this survey is that these guidelines were more guidance than prescriptive, and they're just generally too vague. And we also came to the assumption that there may be more that is behind the firewalls for the institutions than what's actually published and for us to get on the web. And so you, for instance, sitting in the gallery may know more about what we were able to get access to. And we've mentioned a couple of times Boyer. Only one institution actually mentioned that they have referred to Boyer in their documentation that we were able to find in our survey of institutions. And in our ACRL survey, as Alex mentioned, we got 515 responses, and you'll see here some of the results of that survey. Of course, there's a range of appointments and development institutions, et cetera, throughout ACRL, which is what we expected. And only 29% of the responses that we received were from tenure track librarians. And on the other side of that, 29% did not specify what status they were. And the majority of our respondents for the survey did specify that they are undertaking some sort of scholarship or research activity. So this is something that is going to be of interest to the majority of individuals in the field. This slide has got a lot of information on it, but we wanted to show you just the wide variety of different scholarship and research activities that our field is undergoing right now. And this is one of the things that really, we sort of knew was out there, but it sort of reaffirmed what we were considering as we developed this framework. Conference presentations was by far, as you can see, it was really out there. Then peer review, journal articles, publications, book chapters, and poster presentations. I don't think that's shocking to anyone, but then you'll see some of the other things that also popped up on this list. And these are some of the framework influences. We've mentioned the Becker model, and it has 5 impact areas, and you'll see this reflected in our framework. And those impact areas are the advancement of knowledge, clinical implementation, community benefit, legislation and policy, and economic benefit. Of course, we didn't take those 5 areas specifically and put them into, but as you'll see here, sort of how Becker is reflected, that sort of look is how our framework is shaped, which Rachel will get into in a minute. And then we also looked at she's going to flip to it here in a second, I think. Yeah, hold on. She's going, hold on. And is it going to come up?
Oh, are you not seeing it? Sorry.
No, it's not popping up.
I clicked on the link accidentally.
Yeah.
Yep. Let me stop my share and I'll restart it. Sorry.
That's okay.
Let's see. Sorry, everyone. One little link can take you so awry. All right. Is that good?
Yeah. And then Boyer's, as we've mentioned a couple times, was the, oh, there it goes again. There we go. Is the other thing that influenced our framework from his work, Scholarship Reconsidered. And he has 4 areas of impact, which is the scholarship of discovery, integration, application, and teaching and learning. And so we combined those 2 authors and that framework and this text, and that's how we developed our framework. And from there, I will turn it over to Rachel, and she will describe how we constructed the framework for impactful scholarship.
I promise we are getting to the framework itself. We just want to, kind of build the context from where this framework came from. And just one note about the the Becker model. That was for the biomedical sciences. So definitely not appropriate for us to take as is, but serve as an inspiration along with Boyer. Okay. So a bit about how we think this should be used. And Alex started to touch on this in what the goals of the committee were. So we have this framework for evaluating scholarship, but we really see it as trying to support a really wide variety of librarian responsibilities, as Alex talked about. So we see this as framing possibilities rather than prescribing specific metrics, approaches, measures, etc. So some of the main case uses we see deal with places where you would be evaluating academic librarian scholarship. So rank, tenure, promotion, or possibly negotiating changes in status. So for example, I'm currently on continuing appointment, but there is talk at our institution about, I know this will be a surprise to everyone, moving to tenure. That would be one instance in which it might be helpful to start contextualizing our scholarship as we prepare to make that case. We see this as an entry point for individual librarians to tell their own impact story, and providing more ways to do that than maybe currently exist within their documentation or guidance. And I think most importantly, that we don't see this framework being a standalone operation. This starts to get back to what we didn't set out to tackle in 2017, but things that have happened since we formed our task force, specifically 2 ACRL initiatives. One is a statement that came out last summer that essentially asks academic librarians to choose open access publications when possible. And it's a pretty strong statement in support of open access that we haven't had before. The ACRL's Research and Scholarly Environment Task Force also came out with a report It's over 50 pages, but it really talks about equitable models for production of scholarship. In recognizing that traditional models of scholarship, and by traditional, you feel free to substitute peer-reviewed journal articles, journals or journals that have existed for a long time, are not always participating in equitable models of producing scholarship. And that's a big problem, and that's one of the things that this report tackles. However, measuring academic output and evaluating it can come directly into conflict, as we'll talk about pretty soon. So our idea was that we should be taking all three of these documents in tandem and using them all to inform things like updating guidelines or considering how an individual would frame their own impact. So a brief, I promise we will have a link directly to the framework if you haven't seen it yet, and we'll give you a minute to pull it all up. But first, just to orient you to some of the main structural elements of the framework itself. Partly because of that survey that showed such a wide variety of different types of research and scholarly outputs that librarians are engaged in or are encouraged to engage in, we similarly made this a really broad framework with lots of different types of outputs that are designed to support a wide variety of activities and expectations at different institutions. The other big structural element is that we created two different types of impact. And this is really responding to where librarians sit as their role as not only scholars, but also practitioners. And that a fair amount of the research and scholarly output we create may be aiming to impact librarians in their practitioner role rather than purely in a scholarly role. So the two main categories are scholarly and practitioner. And a lot of what we would consider to be the more traditional metrics and measures, things that we might be more used to seeing as ways to contextualize impact, tend to appear in the scholarly impact column. And then the practitioner is a little, I don't know if fuzzier is the right word, but more wide ranging of different ways to demonstrate how your scholarship may be impacting other people that goes beyond, say, a citation. But maybe it was included in a conference presentation. Maybe someone emailed you, like you guys could email me or any of us after this presentation to continue that conversation. And that's its own type of impact that we labeled under the practitioner impact category. And just another reminder that this is not meant to be prescriptive, but just to bring up possibilities, okay? One other note before we start looking at the framework itself is this issue of journal level metrics, most notably impact factor. This was always going to be a big question of what do we do about it? This is part of why we did so much background research, is to try and figure out what are the standards that are currently in place, how have other societies tackled this, and how similar are they to our profession? So we found that some institutions did have some sort of ranking system within journals, but that, as we said, peer review tends to be the more common base factor. And we also, harkening back to the Research and Scholarly Environment report, we wanted to make people explicitly aware of the fact that engaging in this kind of ranking may come at the expense of supporting more of those traditional publications at the expense of ones that embrace more equitable models of scholarly production. So we're not saying you should do this, you shouldn't do this, but these are things that are all really good to keep in mind as we have these conversations toward a goal of something like updating guidelines at an institution. It's really about what makes the most sense for your individual institutional needs and individual needs as well. And so we do include some other journal level measures, like does it have peer review, what is the acceptance rate, but don't include citation-based metrics like impact factor. So just to address that explicitly. And now I'm going to give you a minute. If you haven't seen the framework itself, now is a good time, now that we've talked about it, to actually pull it up. So we have a couple of links here. Hopefully the second one is a little easier to type, and Jennifer has also included a link to the framework in the chat. So I'm literally just going to sit for a few seconds so that people can pull it up if you want. If not, there will be a snippet of the framework on the next slide, just so we can walk you through what this looks like. But do note the entire document also includes a 4-page introduction that actually talks in a more summary level about a lot of the things that we just discussed. So feel free to read the introduction, but it should all sound fairly familiar to this presentation. And then the actual framework starts on page 5. All right, so I'm going to move forward, but feel free to ignore me if you want to continue just reading the framework or are still opening it up. So as promised, our framework has 3 columns, the first column being the type of scholarly or research output. And this should look, again, somewhat familiar from the Becker model. As Jennifer mentioned, we did take some stylistic elements from it. And then we've got potential scholarly impact metrics and measures in the second column, and the same thing with practitioner impact metrics and measures in the third column. I think it's also good to mention that this is not meant to be absolutely comprehensive, that there are certainly other ways to demonstrate impact beyond what we've mentioned here. And there are probably research outputs that we didn't include. There are a couple that we explicitly address in our introduction. One that I remember specifically being grants is not a category of output because there wasn't agreement about whether it in itself was a scholarly or research output. Some people would argue that it should be a measure of a different type of output. So there are some limits to what is and is not included. So again, not prescriptive, but just a guidance. That's why it's a framework and not a policy or any of those stronger words that might be used to describe a document. And then, oh yeah, that was the last slide. I was like, why is the link here? Wait, I already showed the link. So I think with that, it was a pretty brief introduction. Just to point out that another link that Alex did put up is some more of the data that we gathered. We did a lot of information gathering and have presented more of it previously. But if you are more interested in some of those finer points, we got a lot of really interesting data because we surveyed over 500 ACRL people, and even things as simple as what is your status, I think can be really helpful for other people in their own research projects. And if you are curious about any of that data, I encourage you to reach out. We cannot publish it because that would be against the IRB, what we promised to people that took that survey. But there are some more limited things that we can share with people for research purposes. So with that, I haven't noticed any questions come in the chat, but I think now is a good time to pause and see if there's anything that I missed and see what questions you guys have that we can answer. Alex, I see a question from Susan about how would you define digital scholarship? I'm happy to let you know.
Well, hi, Susie. A shout out to USF Tampa, my hometown and the first academic library I ever used in my life. Susie's the education librarian, and we know each other through EBSS. I think defining digital scholarship is really just defining scholarship. It just happens to be in a digital or online medium, and it doesn't necessarily just have to be a traditional Word document or PDF, but it could be a pastiche of multiple forms of media. And I also like to think about explaining digital scholarship as a way that we can get scholars and ourselves to translate our work in various forms so that it's more digestible, but may also link to the extra content that's available. So just as the framework we're sharing with you today has a link in it to our additional and extra information, not the data, but sort of the how-to we came together. That's also a form of extensible scholarship, which is also digital. And I think what I've shared is contestable. I think any institution or any scholar can come up with their own preferred definition.
I think it is tricky because there is also disciplinary differences in that definition. So I was tempted to say, I think the American Historical Association, one of the documents we looked at was specific to, at least one of them was talking about digital scholarship, but they may define it, but it's going to be defined within their disciplinary context. And I'm not sure that academic librarianship or librarianship has their own unique definition that would work. And it's definitely not something that we tried to tackle.
Right. Well, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Rachel. We tried to stay away from being prescriptive in how we defined it because each library may define it a tad differently from every other library. And so it allows each institution to define how that will work for each institution. And so we sort of left it more at that broader level so that the framework will be able to be used individually as it works for each institution, instead of saying digital scholarship is defined as this blob of entities and leaving it as only that blob of entities, because what works today may not work 6 months from now.
And that was really one of our biggest challenges, was trying to make this flexible enough that people could see their own research and scholarship in it, while not being overly encompassing, I guess. So we had a lot of debate of what we should and should not include and how we categorize things. So, it's not ever going to be perfect and describe everyone equally. I see a question from Scott about whether we looked at the Leiden Manifesto when drafting this document. And I think not specifically, but that it helped informed us get to this place of creating the task force. For those who aren't familiar, the Leiden Manifesto is really encouraging different ways of measuring scholarship, I would say. And I think it's probably maybe the most pointed about impact factor. So you definitely hear some traces of the Leiden Manifesto in this. And I would say for anyone who is grappling with some of these questions about how to measure scholarship, and Scott or others, please feel free to give a far better definition of the Leiden Manifesto. That's kind of my back of the brain, haven't looked at it recently, summary of it. That it could be another source to turn to try and make that case for inclusion of some of these different metrics. And along those lines, I see Susan having a similar question about the role of altmetrics within the content of the framework, that altmetrics are difficult to define. I think if you want to make a very broad statement, more things that you can categorize as altmetrics are included in that practitioner category, where we don't exactly necessarily know what all of the metrics might mean exactly. What does it mean if a whole bunch of people have tweeted about my work? Is that good? Is that bad? Is it neutral? Though some of those questions also exist with citations, but I think they tend to get more amplified when we talk about altmetrics. And right now people tend to talk about altmetrics as a complement to more traditional methods of evaluation, which is more represented by that scholarly category. So I think our main goal in this was to try and support people who want to use those kinds of metrics and try and as part of their impact story and contextualizing them. So I think that's kind of the relationship of altmetrics to this framework, because they do appear in there, but not just altmetrics. And mostly in the practitioner category, I think we saw as the most appropriate place to include them. I'm going to stop talking for a second and catch up on chat.
I was just going to follow up on a point that Scott Lanning made about really it's the the quality, the analysis of the work itself should be part of the impact. I think, at least if I'm interpreting what he's written correctly. But again, how do you define quality? And so again, that's going to that's going to get into another realm of complication.
I see a question about the extent to which we considered international collaborations and the nature of their implications for any limitations of the framework. I think there's a lot of things that impact, oh boy, that's not a good way to put it, that affect impact. And, you know, we see that when we look at criticisms of impact factor. And those we could never try and tackle all of those situations. There's a lot of different things that affect why and how people impact each other in their scholarship. But that would definitely be one example, international collaborations. So that's something that I would say, if that's something that is of particular interest to your institution, that I encourage a conversation and possible inclusion in your own guidelines about how you want to be explicitly acknowledge the role of international collaborations. And I generally, that's what I would say about grants as well. I saw a follow-up question about wrestling with grants and that there's variability, and asking for a bit more context about variability. I think some of the variability arises with roles, responsibilities, and expectations. Am I required to apply for grants? Am I highly encouraged to apply for grants? Is it considered part of my primary responsibilities? Is it part of service or scholarship? There's a lot of different ways that we could potentially categorize grants. And some people might see grants as a natural output of research rather than the beginning of research, while others may see it as a standalone type of scholarly output in and of itself. So those were some of the different variances that we were hearing and grappling with when we decided to say, you know, let's just not try and tackle that, because we don't want to make a definitive statement about how you might want to view grants in your own guidance. I'm not seeing other questions. I'm seeing some great comments, and thank you to those who are helping fill in gaps. Scott, you have a question about co-authorship, I'm seeing, and dividing credit for that. That again is something we did discuss and decided that we mention, but don't weigh in on. And that again is an institutional level decision, I think. Partly because we don't want to prescribe, right? We don't want to say it's good to co-author, or if you co-author, you should definitely only get half or a third of the credit. I think a lot of this really comes down to nuance and individual uses that I tend to fall on the side of, as an individual, and I'm someone who has only ever co-authored, that it's up to me to describe my impact and my role within any co-authored publications, but not to say this is how you should measure me as a result. So yeah, I'm sorry, a lot of these answers are really non-answers, but that's how we hoped that the framework would be the most applicable to the most people, is as kind of providing possibilities rather than coming down and saying, we like this, we don't like this, this is how you should treat this. But just, why don't you take these documents and have these discussions with your colleagues and see if you can come to consensus, or try and provide guidance for those who are trying to write their own impact story, as it were. Go ahead, Alex.
No, I was just gonna say, Rachel, I think the altmetrics question is good for you. I mean, you did touch on it a little bit, but maybe say a little bit more, particularly, and maybe folks are interested in hearing about your impact story a little bit as well at American, and why our framework ends up being more middle of the road.
Sure. Yeah, so I think I mentioned that more of the altmetrics, or what we might categorize as altmetrics, tends to be in that practitioner category. My own personal story with why I am so passionate about this, part of it is what Alex was talking about, the institutional level of just having these discussions. But personally, I used to produce a podcast for library instruction, and trying to contextualize the impact that we were having, because it is not a peer-reviewed source, and getting people to understand, how this could be considered scholarship and why, was hard. And I found myself trying to kind of look for ways to justify what I was doing. And that's when I came across altmetrics. This is like 2011, 2012, and probably not 2011 because altmetrics was not a term then. But as these conversations were starting to happen about different ways to describe impact and scholarly efforts and scholarship, that's how I kind of came into this. And I don't know if this is something that people care about or not, but I'm going to talk about it. An earlier draft of this framework came along with some case uses that we were trying to provide as more concrete examples of how you might turn this framework into a specific case use. And one of them was my own documentation for promotion to librarian, which happened 2 years ago. Oh, the years, they all run together. But at that point, we had a draft of this framework. And so I decided to use it to create my own documentation talking about my role in creating the framework, which is very meta. But the way that I tackled it was I took my publications and noted which ones were peer reviewed, which ones were editor reviewed, and then had a column for citations, and then another column for just other types of impact, where, for example, I did include an altmetric score for one that got, a fair amount of interest actually within the chemistry community. And some other measures like downloads. For my presentations, I tried to include audience size when I could remember it, if I had any kinds of follow-ups. So a lot of what you'll see in that practitioner category, as it was appropriate, I included it as kind of a supplement, a complementary metric to some of the other metrics that I included. But just for anyone who is unsure about what altmetrics are, because I don't think I ever said that, they are generally speaking a set of metrics and measures that arise from the sharing and interacting with scholarly content in an online setting. So it's a pretty broad range. It can be anything from a comment on a social media post to a sharing on social media, to downloads, views, how many people have saved a piece of scholarship into a Mendeley library, for example. But a lot of different things that don't necessarily say this is definitely impacting somebody, but is an indication that something is happening, that it's generating interest or attention, and tell a different story than just including something like a citation count. So that's a lot of that you will see in this model throughout.
I'd add to the Susie brought up the idea of having other case studies, and so while we did attempt to have case studies, but in the end, and I don't know, Jennifer or Rachel, if you want to talk more about it, but they weren't something just wasn't right. It wasn't a fit. Maybe it was too specific for specific institutions, and it had been a suggestion that was given to the committee, right, Rachel, that and it had and maybe it had come up multiple times or it came up at Charleston, but what's your thinking now about case studies now that the framework's out?
So yeah, after we did several rounds of feedback and different drafts of this framework, and I know at least 1 or 2 people that were participated in earlier drafts are here today. So thank you for your help in making this final version possible. And it was at Charleston in 2019 that we had some people that said, you know, it's very conceptual. Having some concrete examples would really help us understand this a bit better. So we included them, and then when we submitted it to the ACRL Board of Standards, there were some more negative reactions to it, that it starts to become too limiting, I think. And it is really difficult to take 1 or 2 specific case uses as representatives of a broader concept. So I think that's why we left it out. Ultimately, that, you know, there were some comments like, hey, what about this case? And I was like, well, we don't have anyone on the committee that has experienced that specific case. And rather than try and create additional case uses to respond to specific potential case, you know, uses, we decided to let's leave this a bit broader. But I will say personally, if anyone finds it useful to see my own personal scholarly documentation, I am more than happy to send that out. It's in Dropbox and publicly available because it was a case use originally. But my hope is over time, you know, ideally we would have some sort of repository of like how people are using this, similar to the information literacy framework. I think it's unlikely that'll happen unless there's another, you know, body that's charged with upkeep or revisions of this in the future. But it is never a bad idea to share how this is being used. And if there's a big takeaway in how we see this framework being the most useful, it's in the power of sharing, that letting people know when you are using things that you found helpful to them and is informing your own research, scholarship, practitioner work. The stronger we become and the better we are able to articulate the impact that we've had on others. And that would be one great way in which we could do that, but not one that we set up.
And I'd add too, another reason really to make sure we're collaborating this way is to ensure that we're not allowing administrators who have no idea what librarians do define our scholarship and who we are. And I'll speak for myself now that I'm no longer at Rachel's institution fully, but that was where we found ourselves for a very long time, is trying to continuously argue for the worth and generative nature of our scholarship to a provost who didn't necessarily always think that our work was generative enough or impactful enough.
Well, and someone who is used to relying on impact factors as a definitive way to define the quality of scholarship, which I think I'm hoping we have demonstrated is not a common feature in our discipline, that peer review tends to be the more commonly defined benchmark of quality rather than something like an impact factor.
Well, and it's also being reflective of the difference just between the status as well, not just the being able to reflect what we do to administration, but also the differences between the tenure and the non-tenure, and having something that is reflective of both of those status, so that it's not just, you know, this is it and is only reflective of the tenure status, which is a problem sometimes.
And Susan, I agree that, you know, there's a fair amount of scholarship about the various issues with impact factor, but impact factor was not created for the humanities. It is ill-defined within the humanities, and that many impact factors created by Claravit, and a lot of humanities journals are not indexed in Web of Science to even have an impact factor. So that is one of many reasons, along with just disciplinary differences in how we cite, that is really different between humanities, social sciences, and STEM fields. I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm wondering if there are other areas that people would like to discuss more. I'm not hearing other questions, and I'm seeing the participant number slowly dwindle. So I'm thinking that now is probably a time to thank you all for coming today. We hope that you find this framework useful, and please feel free. Oh, I did not put up the last slide with our contact information. There you go. Please be in touch. We want to help people as much as we can to make this something that really works for you. So if we can help clarify things in the future, you know, whatever it is, we're happy to help.
And thank you, Rachel, Jennifer, and Alex for a great session today. That was really informative, and we will be sharing out the recording shortly. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. I will go ahead and stop the recording.